Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be talking about the New York City mayoral primary from last night, and we'll be talking about the fact that, to the surprise of many, very likely the next Democratic nominee for mayor of the largest city in the country will be Zohran Mamdani, a Democratic socialist who is just 33 years old. No doubt it was a historic night, and I'm here to talk about what happened, why it happened, and really what it means. And we'll talk a little bit about the November general election, which Mamdani will be very heavily favored in as the Democratic nominee in a blue city like New York. Now, the first thing we have to talk about is the fact that it isn't officially over yet. Now, it basically is. Mamdani has declared victory and Andrew Cuomo has conceded, but obviously New York City has a ranked choice voting system, so they, unless someone gets past 50%, unless they win an outright majority in the first round, they're going to reallocate the votes. So what that means is that they're going to take from bottom really to top. They're going to take away the votes that went to the smallest candidates and redistribute them. So, for example, the voters who chose, or the 1,328 people in New York City who voted for Selma Bartholomew, whoever they ranked, second, or third, like whoever they ranked on their ballot, it'll be reallocated to them. And maybe some of them voted for Prince or Ramos or Blake. Eventually, in later rounds, those are going to be reallocated too. And it's going to come down to Cuomo and Mamdani. And Mamdani, was expected to actually be trailing tonight, or last night, I should say, because the expectation was that Cuomo was going to get to around 40% of the vote. Maybe Mamdani would be at 35 or 38. But no, Mamdani, the reason that this race is essentially over is that Mamdani outright leads Cuomo and is only 6.5% away from getting to 50%. And a lot of that's going to come from people who have kind of, aligned themselves closer with him than Cuomo. Prime example, Brad Lander. He got a respectable 11.3% of the vote, got a clear third place. And again, just adding on Lander's votes to Mamdani would be up to around 54.8%, which is, well, more than 50%, and he wouldn't even need a vote from anyone else. Of course, I don't think that every single of these 112,000 Brad Lander voters ranked Mamdani ahead of Cuomo. The majority did, seeing as Lander cross-endorsed Mamdani, so that's going to probably be enough to get Mamdani to 50%. But obviously, there's going to be some people who didn't rank Mamdani ahead of Cuomo, or maybe didn't rank either Mamdani or Cuomo. So even if you don't think Brad Lander is enough to get Mamdani over the top, which he probably still will be, Adrian Adams, I think, was closer to Mamdani. Like AOC ranked Adams on her ballot alongside Mamdani and Lander. So I think a solid chunk of her voters might have, ranked Mamdani ahead of Cuomo. Scott Stringer potentially as well. I think Zelnor Myrie especially. And then there's some other candidates like Jessica Ramos and Whitney Tilson who are probably going to skew more towards Cuomo. But as you can see, the majority of the field was more closely aligned to Mamdani than to Andrew Cuomo. And that means that unless we, miraculously, voters who voted for more Mamdani-aligned candidates somehow ranked Cuomo ahead of Mamdani on their ballots, it's going to be a pretty clear victory for Mamdani, and he will probably actually expand his margin. He's up by 7 right now. He'll probably expand that in the ranked choice, in the final round of ranked choice voting when it's just him versus Cuomo. He could win like 56 to 44, 55 to 45. We're being honest with ourselves here. So not only is this a victory for Mamdani, it is a decisive victory, and I think it's going to, like I said, it's going to be larger than it is even tonight. And then one last thing I want to say before we talk about like the results specifically is that Zohran Mamdani was not, I think, at any point favored to win this race. We got one Emerson poll the 2 days before the election that had him up by 4, but we also had like a YouGov poll that had him down by 14 the same day. And we also had, of course, just the history here, which is that New York City broadly has not liked to elect, or the Democratic electorate here at least has not liked to elect a ton of, progressive candidates, right? The reason that AOC winning her primary in 2018 against Joe Crowley, who was a kind of a longtime establishment generic Democrat, the reason that was so shocking was because historically, especially in these parts of New York City, right, like around here, you are, typically in more more establishment territory, and at the end of the day, that didn't really bode well for Mamdani. And you go back to 2021, where Maya Wiley actually I thought ran a pretty solid progressive campaign, right? She had the endorsement of Hakeem Jeffries. She actually had a lot of institutional support across the city, but she was still definitely a progressive candidate. Maya Wiley still came in third place. And a lot of people thought that was the most institutional supported progressive in New York City was going to get for a while. And Andrew Cuomo, he received the backing of like Michael Bloomberg, of other more establishment to moderate Democrats, and it still didn't matter. It still was not enough to beat Mamdani, who was getting support from AOC and Bernie Sanders, but was not really winning over any part of the Democratic establishment to the extent that Maya Wiley did in 2021. And so that's really interesting to me, just the fact that Mamdani was so successful. So we'll talk a little bit now about why I think Mamdani was successful and why he's very likely going to be the next Democratic nominee for mayor. I think, first of all, and this is something that he did very well that Democrats have not done well in recent years, especially, Kamala Harris, I don't think ran that bad of a campaign, but I think she certainly didn't do well on this particular dynamic, which was the message that the Mamdani campaign chose to focus on. It wasn't, obviously he attacked Andrew Cuomo for being like, I think he called him like a disgraced former governor on the debate stage multiple times. But that wasn't the central message of his campaign. The message of his campaign was a New York City you can afford. Let's make it affordable again, right? And it was I think someone pointed this out online. I was reading, obviously, some reactions to the result last night, and someone pointed out that Mamdani and Trump actually ran similar campaigns in the sense that they both just hammered, pretty relentlessly the cost of living, right? Like it's not affordable. The cost of groceries and public transportation is way up. It's not fair. And most people, and that resonates with a lot of people because the fact is New York City is expensive. It is really hard to afford to live in New York City nowadays, which is a shame. And Mamdani, whether or not you believe he's going to, fix it or make it worse, I'm not here to comment on that, pointed that out pretty effectively. And it's a pretty unifying message because whether you're a Democrat or Republican, you still have to buy groceries and you still have to, take the subway, right? And so that's a pretty effective message that even though, obviously, go back to 2024, Democrats, acknowledged that they were not that costs were high. They didn't make it a focal point of the campaign, whereas Trump, to an extent, did. And so, secondly, I think this is kind of a less tangible thing, but I think Mamdani is charismatic, and I think that the campaign he ran, whether it was online or in person, he came off very genuinely, whereas Cuomo did not. Cuomo, he's older, he's more establishmentarian, he's easier, first of all, it's harder for him because he's easier to label. It's like, oh, he's just this, corrupt guy who, he already resigned from being governor 4 years ago. Why would he care about us now? So I guess Mamdani had that inherent advantage. But even putting Cuomo aside, Mamdani pretty clearly, I thought was good at social media. He wasn't like a lot of candidates are just too online, like they'll just spend all day on Twitter and they don't actually campaign. I thought Mamdani balanced it pretty well, right? Like on Instagram and on TikTok and whatnot, and obviously on Twitter as well. But he was actually more Instagram, I think, centric than Twitter centric, which is actually pretty good for reaching especially young people because most young people use Instagram more than Twitter. And then he also I thought his debates were pretty good, and I thought he came off, there were times where he'd be just walking the streets of New York and he'd be talking to people, right? Like he felt more real and genuine than I think most politicians. And again, I'm not saying whether or not that's going to translate into like effective governance, because again, that's not like what I'm here to talk about. But I think objectively you can recognize that was a pretty effective part of a campaign. And finally, the Brad Lander cross endorsement was huge. It's probably going to be the nail in the coffin for Cuomo when all the ranked choice voting is tabulated and whatnot. All right, so let's talk about the results just for a second here. I've already explained why I think Mamdani won. First of all, Staten Island was, I think, pretty striking. This is probably the most shocking result to me. This is a borough I think Cuomo was expected to win by like 20 to 30 points. He's only going to win it by 9. It might be even less when we get the ranked choice voting tabulation because, again, a lot of those Adams and Lander voters are probably going to support Mamdani. Cuomo will probably narrowly win it, but I don't think it'll be more than like 3 or 4 points, to be honest, which is insane because this is supposed to be like a Cuomo plus 25 borough. And then the only other borough he won was the Bronx. Again, this, was expected. He did quite well here, honestly. I think this is probably his best performance. Mamdani got only 34% of the vote. This is mostly because, again, we potentially take a look at the precinct maps because why not? I think that if you look at the precincts, you can see that, broadly speaking, the like Mamdani did okay in some like majority Hispanic precincts, but he really did not do well in the majority of black precincts. Although again, some of them were closer than expected. And if I believe we can kind of take a look at by neighborhood, right? Like you go to, I'm actually not going to go through all these, but like for Fordham, for example, Cuomo plus 18, which was quite good for him, going up to these kind of areas. And actually, you can show right here, right? Like, whereas I just want to use Fordham as an example. I can't find it for whatever reason. Oh, here it is. I swear, am I insane or did here we go, right? Like that's just an example of like, how kind of these areas were still pretty favorable to Cuomo, even though Mamdani made inroads, a ton of other places. Okay, so let's the Bronx is interesting, but it to me the most like nail in the coffin I think type of result that we had was in Queens, which was honestly I expected to narrowly vote for Andrew Cuomo. I thought it'd be close. I thought Cuomo was going to lose Manhattan and Brooklyn by enough to actually lose the race. If you watch my last video, I predicted a very narrow Mamdani victory, not to this scale. But Queens, I thought he was going to win by a couple points. And right now, even before the ranked choice voting, he's losing by 7. So that's a nail in the coffin. And again, Mamdani and Land are on their own combined for 52% here. And this is, again, because, right, like Mamdani built a coalition of white voters. He did quite well with them, but he did especially well with Asian voters, too. And obviously, Queens, a lot of neighborhoods that have huge Asian voting blocks. And that's enough to get, him over the line. Whereas Cuomo didn't do well with white voters, didn't do well with Asian voters, did not do well at all with Hispanic voters. Black voters were the only demographic, I believe, that in terms of the only racial demographic that preferred him. And that's not enough to get you to victory in Queens. And then, of course, as expected, Brooklyn, favored Mamdani by a little more than I thought, but still not surprising that he won Brooklyn. And then Manhattan was actually not too amazing for Mamdani. He only won it by 5%, but you have to remember that Brad Lander this is by far Brad Lander's best borough. He got, I think, nearly 18% of the vote here, 17% of the vote here. So that's probably part of it. And I bet, especially in Manhattan, the vast majority of Brad Lander voters are going to rank Mamdani second, and they combined for, 56% of the vote on their own. So that'll be I would say, a pretty clear victory for Mamdani when it's all said and done. So again, this was, I think maybe aside from the Bronx, Mamdani outperformed pretty vastly in these boroughs. And just to talk a little bit about the general election, they've updated it. It's going to be at least a 4-way race between Mamdani, the Democrat, slew with a Republican, Adams, the incumbent who's running as an independent, then Jim Walden, who is a businessman. Or actually, he's an attorney, but I think he's also, he's like a private. He's worked with a private practice, but Cuomo might run. There's some whispers of that. I think I don't think he's going to, because he seemed pretty defeated in his concession speech. He seemed, like, okay, this was Mamdani's moment. It wasn't ours. I get he's filed under like an independent name, but I still think it's going to be a 4-way race, really a 3-way race, because Jim Walden has not gained any traction. So just assuming Cuomo doesn't run, it's going to be, I think, Mamdani probably winning the vast majority of Democrats, and then I think Slew and Adams are probably going to split Republicans. Adams might do well with some more moderate Democrats who obviously are alienated by Mamdani, who is definitely the most left-wing candidate that's ever been nominated for mayor of New York City. So it'll be interesting to see the coalitions, but I think broadly Mamdani, as having like the banner of the Democratic nominee next to him, very likely to win. And so this was a historic result, no doubt about it. It was surprising to many. I predicted Mamdani was going to win, but I didn't think he was going to win by as much as he's expected to at this point. So just want to update you all on that, and I will see you all next time.